So people always ask me, Destiny, how did you get involved in all of this Israel stuff? Where did your interest in all this even start? It all started when I was about 18 years old. The pastor of the church that I grew up in was a city director for Christians United for Israel. So we always had different speakers coming in and out of our church talking about stuff that I really didn't understand and I really didn't care about, if I'm being honest, I was like, yes, amen, go Israel. I didn't really care about anything, and I didn't really understand what anyone was talking about. But one day, the guy who was actually in the role that I'm in now, his name is John, he was passing through the town that I lived in, and my pastor said to me, hey, do you want to get Longhorn with me and John next week so you can hear all about Christians United for Israel? And in my head, I'm thinking, no thanks, because like I said, I wasn't interested. But what are you going to say when your pastor offers to take you to Longhorn? Yes, that was really the only option. So I go to this lunch, and, I heard what the guy had to say, and, really smart guy, awesome guy, and he was talking about, standing with Israel and the terrorism in Israel and just, all this stuff that I, was interesting, but I just really didn't care. I was like, oh, yes, amen, go Israel. But I wasn't really, passionate about it. I wasn't interested until he said one thing that just really made a difference in my life. He said, we have to know about this because God's people perish for lack of knowledge. And when he said that, I knew if I didn't know more, if I didn't take the initiative to learn what in the world was he talking about, I knew that I might perish for some reason. I knew my life would never really be all that it could be if I didn't take the initiative to figure out what he was talking about. So it's a little dramatic, but that's the truth. So I just followed God's I followed God's instructions after that. I was just obedient to that notion, that feeling that I had, that this was something that I had to be a part of. And so when I started college in the fall after that, it was maybe 3 months later, I decided to start a Christians United for Israel chapter at the University of Missouri. And the more I studied out, what in the world was going on with Israel, why did they need my support so much? The more I studied all that out, the more I realized that a lot of the struggles that the Jewish people and the state of Israel are up against today was really similar to what everyone, the heroes of the Christian faith that I looked up to, their struggles were really the same. So that's what I'm going to talk to you guys about tonight. And really, the story of Israel, it's thousands and thousands of years long. It just doesn't start in 1948 when the state of Israel was really reestablished, okay? It's thousands and thousands of years long, and it really all started with Abraham. Ever heard of him? The father the father of our faith, pretty much. If you look in Genesis, if you guys could pull up that scripture. If you look in Genesis, so we see God, he comes to Abraham one day. His name wasn't Abraham at the time, it was Abram. But God comes to him and says, you are going to be the father of a nation. It says, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. Well, what was crazy about that statement, that promise that God gave to Abraham, was Abraham didn't have any descendants. He didn't have any children. He was a man of wealth. He had, a lot going for him and his wife, but he wasn't successful in the sense that he didn't have any children, and that was a measurement of your success back then. So not only was this dream, there was nothing to prove that Nothing in the natural that said, okay, God is able to make me into a great nation. No, he was old. He and his wife were past the years of having children. And not only that, but at one point in their life, even when they were younger, they didn't have kids. So it wasn't just the fact that they were old that was preventing them from having children and this promise being fulfilled. There was something else preventing them from having children, something that needed to be healed. So for God to come to Abraham and say, you are going to be a father someday, and your children are going to turn into a nation, it was just impossible. But how many of you guys know God is faithful? And what's really crazy about this story with Abraham is that the more you read out his story and the more you study out his life, from the time that God makes this initial promise to him until the time that the promise is fulfilled, he messes up like a lot. He does. He commits adultery while he's trying to make this promise happen in his own strength. He isn't a very good father to the child who's a product of that adulterous relationship. He's not the father that he could have been because of that adulterous relationship. He almost gets his wife in a situation where she's committing adultery. But it wasn't about how good Abraham was. It was about how good God was. God is faithful when we are faithless, because that's just who he is, okay? So over years and years and years, we see that it takes some time for this promise to be fulfilled in Abraham's life. But eventually, God does fulfill it. God does fulfill it, and we have the Jewish people. But even after they became, this great nation, they still, achieving all that God had for them, it took some time. If you look at the life of Moses, during the time of Moses, the Jewish people, yes, God had fulfilled that promise that he gave to Moses, or Abraham. I was telling some people earlier that I was speaking somewhere a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking about Abraham, and I was getting really into it, and I was like, God promised Abraham, blah, blah, blah. And I realized about 5 minutes into it, I had been saying Moses the whole time, and everyone was really confused. That's not going to happen tonight. But from the time that it took, like I said, so God fulfilled that promise to Abraham. He did have descendants, and they did turn into a nation, but the whole promise took some time to get fulfilled. They weren't prosperous quite yet, like God had really intended them to be, okay? So during the time of Moses, we see, yes, they did become a people, and they did become a great nation, and Abraham did have a bunch of descendants. But in Egypt, they were enslaved. They were poor. They were just victim to the oppression of the Egyptians. And God, he really handpicked Moses and raised him up from such a young age and positioned him at just the right place in his life to stand for the Jewish people, to stand for something and have them liberated. And what's so funny about this story of Moses, when we think about Moses, we're like, oh yeah, Moses, he led the Jewish people out of captivity, and he led them into liberation, and they learned how to determine their own fate and govern themselves. And he, parted the sea with God's help. And when we see pictures or paintings of Moses, we see him over the sea just being divided, just being parted. But when you go, when you look in Exodus at that first passage where God is, speaking to Moses and telling him, go before Pharaoh and advocate for the Jewish people to be set free from captivity, Moses is like, I actually can't because I talk a little weird, whatever it is. Maybe he had a speech impediment, or he, some people say he stuttered, or he had a lisp, or, whatever the problem was. He thought that God wasn't aware of his shortcomings, and he thought that God was going to put him in a place where he was going to be awkward and embarrassed. But God doesn't do that to us. Even when we're called to do something that just seems crazy, it just seems like, God, I can't do that. He won't put you in a place that he hasn't prepared you for. He won't just put you somewhere and not equip you. And I remember feeling like that sitting in that first meeting where someone was approaching me about getting involved, standing up for Israel. I was like, I don't even know what you're talking about. How am I gonna, fight for Israel? I'm not a fighter. I just want to, sing songs to myself and like color in coloring books. That I just was not about that life. But God doesn't put us somewhere that he won't prepare us for. He'll give you the tools to stand, to take a stand. And we really see that in Exodus with God in his using Moses. Now in the end, I don't recommend this, but Moses kind of negotiated with God, and he was like, okay, I'll do it, but my brother's got to come with me. And God was like, fine. Maybe he wasn't, but that wasn't God's first plan. The first plan was for Moses to do this. And anyway, Aaron's great too, but nothing against him. But you don't have to. You don't have to negotiate with God. He wants you to do well. He wants you to succeed, is what I'm trying to say. So we read in Exodus 3:8, God says to Moses, so I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. It is a land flowing with milk and honey, the land where the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites now live. Whoa, all those people. So when Moses first approaches Pharaoh and he's, nervous and scared, he starts advocating to Pharaoh to let the Jewish people go. He says, let us determine our own fate. Let us, empower ourselves to govern ourselves in the land that God has for us. What's really interesting about this is that this whole situation where you have a leader, a Jewish leader, approaching a leader of the time, saying, let us be our own country. Let us govern ourselves and lead ourselves. That's happened prior to 1948, when the state of Israel was established. That actually happened in 1937. So in 1937, you have the land of Israel, okay, and you have all of these. There was always a Jewish population living there, but through over years and years and years, the Jewish people that had lived there, I'm talking biblical times, they'd gotten dispersed, okay, through foreign occupation and wars and all the things that could displace a people was happening. So you had all these Jewish people living in the Middle East and all of these Jewish people living in Europe and other parts of the world too, but those are the most relevant to what I'm talking about. So in 1930 or pre-1937, you have these Jews living in the land of Israel, and because they were persecuted in the parts of the world where they were living at the time, you have them slowly but surely gathering back in the land of Israel. And there was a lot of conflict between the Jews living there and the Arabs living there, villages, Arab villages attacking Jewish villages, and it was pretty bad. So the British, they were the ones controlling the Middle East at the time, that portion of it. And so they sent a group of people to investigate these conflicts, and they said, okay, we're going to try to figure out what's going on here, and we're going to try to figure out how we can solve these conflicts, okay? So after the British came, the British are coming. No, after the British came and they sent like a team of investigators to figure out like what needed to be done. And they decided, okay, you know what? I have an idea. We should divide this land and there should be a Jewish state for the Jewish people living here and an Arab state for the Arabs living there. And the Jewish people, they were like, yes, let us govern ourselves. Let us, be our own people. Let us determine our own future in the form of a Jewish state. And unfortunately, the Arab leaders, they said no. So you had they said no to the deal, which unfortunately led to the halt of Jewish immigration to that area, and then thousands of people or millions of people perished in the Holocaust. They couldn't get out. They couldn't immigrate. So you have this, this reoccurring, really just major event, where you have these Jewish leaders saying, let us govern ourselves, but these two very different outcomes. Okay? And it's just amazing how there's nothing new under the sun. Really, everything that the Jewish people fought for when we read our Bibles, when we read the Old Testament, is not very different at all from the modern struggle of the Jewish people and what we can see in Israel today. So after the Jewish people, Moses, he and his brother Aaron lead the Jewish people out of Egypt, and they, eventually, over time, it didn't happen as quickly as I believe God wanted it to, but over time, they finally were able to govern themselves. But they faced obstacles, and there were other struggles, and they got attacked by foreign invaders, and one of those groups of people was the Persians. Okay, so the Persian Empire was kind of like in control of things, and the Jewish people living in Jerusalem, they had kind of forgotten who they were. Okay, they weren't protecting themselves. They were pretty much left wide open to attack from foreign invaders. And when this man, his name was Nehemiah, he was working for the king of Persia. And when he found out about what was happening with the Jewish people back in Jerusalem, it broke his heart. And so he asked permission from the king of Persia. He said, will you please let me go back to Jerusalem and just mobilize my community to stand for themselves and just remind them who they were? So he goes back to Jerusalem, and he starts really inspiring the Jewish people there, and he's telling them, like, guys, like, remember who you are. How many times do we forget who we are? God had a promise to the Jewish people back with Abraham. God promised, look, I'm going to turn you into a nation, and everyone who blesses your nation will be blessed, and everyone who curses it will be cursed. That's quite the promise, And he was faithful to that promise. I mean, first of all, he fulfilled that impossible dream of Abraham's. And he didn't leave the Jewish people hanging when they were in Egypt. He freed them from enslavement when it was impossible, when Pharaoh's heart was hardened and he did not want to let them go. But he did it. And over the years, the Jewish people had kind of forgotten that. And that broke Nehemiah's heart, because I think he knew that that wasn't God's plan for them to just live wide open to attacks. So Nehemiah goes back and he starts teaching the people, remember who you are. Remember who you are. And he starts building a wall to protect them from attacks, protect them from foreign invaders. And what's interesting is that even back then, you had people, we can read in the Bible that Nehemiah had people criticizing him. we can read in the Bible that he had to defend and even legitimize his reason for, just wanting the Jewish people in Jerusalem to be protected. It says his reply to someone who was criticizing him was, I replied, the God of heaven will help us succeed. We, his servants, will start rebuilding this wall, but you have no share, legal right, or historic claim in Jerusalem. So, just Nehemiah's confidence that he had heard from the Lord and that he was doing the work of God just really speaks to me. And I just think, how many times have I forgotten the promises that God made to me years and years and years ago? Do we defend what God's told us when someone comes to us and says, who do you think you are? Why do you think that you can, have those things, or that you can do the things that God's put on your heart? Do we walk it out? Because Nehemiah really is such a great example to me of what that looks like, of what saying, actually, you don't know what you're talking about. God has a plan for me, Just defending that is just, wonderful. And also what's really interesting about this, so between 2000 and 2005, Israel was victim to a wave of suicide bombings, okay? It was called the Second Intifada. And basically, during that time, you had people would go to a train station or a coffee shop or a shopping mall, what have you, any civilian place, and there were so many suicide bombings. I think at the height of the Second Intifada, there was 40 suicide bombings in 1 year, okay? So do you guys remember when the Orlando shooting that happened? I think that was last year. So if you can imagine about 40 incidents like that taking place within 1 year, in an area about the size of New Jersey. Okay, that's a lot, okay? So in a desperate attempt to protect their citizens, Israel built a security barrier between Israel's border and where the West Bank, where a lot of the terrorists were coming from. And to this day, even though almost as soon as they started building this barrier, the suicide bombings drastically dropped, okay, to the point where today they're really not an issue. There's other things, but suicide bombings aren't really something that people are, I can't remember the last time I heard of a suicide bombing happening. Okay, and it's because of the security barrier. Even though it's so effective, you still get critics of it saying, well, why should the Jewish people defend themselves in this way? Well, the security barrier isn't to keep anyone out, okay? It's to protect them from attacks. It's to prevent them from, having to wonder when they put their kids on a bus going to school if they're going to see their kid at the end of the day, It seems pretty reasonable. But even as Nehemiah had to defend building this wall to protect the Jewish people in Jerusalem, today you still hear critics, should Jewish people be defending themselves in this way? Should Israelis be able to defend themselves like this? So the next person I want to talk about, I've talked about Abraham and how God put this dream. God really put this dream in his heart to have descendants, and God was faithful to that dream. And God gave Moses the vision of, seeing the Jewish people free in their own land, and God was faithful to that. And Nehemiah, God put it on Nehemiah's heart to mobilize the Jewish people to defend themselves and really remember who they were. The next person I want to talk about is Esther. What Christian girl doesn't love talking about Esther? I don't know. But what I think is so cool about Esther is she was just this this Jewish girl living in Persia who just kind of ended up queen of Persia. It wasn't really anything that she grew up like knowing, like, oh man, I'm going to be queen of Persia someday. It wasn't like that. She just kind of all of a sudden was queen of Persia. And even though while she was preparing to become queen, she was just preparing and preparing and preparing. A lot of time and a lot of preparation and a lot of treatments went into her even seeing the king for the first time and him deciding that he was going to marry her. There was just so much that went into getting her ready for that moment, but she didn't really know what she was preparing for. That's what's so crazy to me. How many of us are in seasons of our lives and we just don't know what God is preparing us for? It's crazy to me. So while Esther's preparing, and she doesn't know what she's preparing for, while she's, in this season of her life where she's just like, here I am, we'll kind of see what happens here. There's something else happening in this story. There's a man named Haman who has this wicked plot to destroy the Jewish people. And Haman goes to the king and he tells the king, hey, there's these people in your kingdom who need to be destroyed. We need to get rid of them. And the king, he doesn't really know what Haman's talking about, I don't think, but he kind of trusts him. So he's like, okay, man, do what you got to do. Here's my signet ring that you need to make all the decisions and write all the legislation. So Esther, she doesn't know that any of that is going on. And then she hears that Mordecai, the man who raised her, she hears that he's a little bit distressed. And what you need to know about her relationship with Mordecai is, so she was an orphan, and Mordecai was her cousin, and he raised her pretty much as his own. And when she was positioned in the palace, when she ended up where she was, he gave her instructions, don't tell anybody you're Jewish. And maybe she thought that was a good idea. Maybe there was some like broader context to where she was like, yes, I should keep it a secret. But maybe she didn't think that she should keep it a secret. We really don't know. Maybe she only kept it a secret because he instructed her to. We really don't know, but the important thing is that she did heed his instructions. And really, had she not, this probably would have been a very different story, but that just tells you what her heart was like towards him. He was her mentor, her father, and she just listened to him. Maybe because she agreed with him, maybe because she didn't, we don't really know. So when she finds out that Mordecai is really distressed, she sends someone to say, Mordecai, what's wrong with you? She heard that he was like mourning and acting really distressed out in public, and I think she even sent him some clothes and was like, put on some better clothes. You look crazy. But he was like, he sent a message to her, what was going on. He said, look, the king made a decree that the Jewish people are going to be destroyed on, this date. You have to go to the king and you have to tell him what's going on, and you have to advocate for our right to live, our right to not be destroyed. And so Esther, she tells Mordecai at first, she says, look, if I go before the king, like I'm married to him, but he's still the king, so I can't just waltz in and be like, hey, how's it going? No, she couldn't just do that. She would be killed if he didn't call for her first, and he hadn't called for her in some time. So, a lot of people say, I don't think that, I've heard, people think that Esther was kind of like arguing back with Mordecai, or kind of being like a coward when she, tells him this. I don't think that's really the case. I think she's saying like, hey, like, I just need to know that you're here, like you're really hearing from God on this, because if you're not, like, I'm a goner. Like, you don't have any more of an inroad with the king anymore if you're wrong about this. So I really need to know if this is really what you think I need to do, okay? So then Mordecai goes to her, or he sends word to her, I should say, with these famous words, famous words. He says, if you don't go before the king, deliverance will come for us from somewhere else. What faith in God, right? Like, even if you don't do what I think God's calling you to do, we're going to be rescued by someone else. But I think he needed to remind her, look, there's other people waiting for your obedience. Who's waiting for your obedience? Because it wasn't just about, Esther and how God used her in that moment. Think about how many people, a nation of people were waiting for her obedience. Had she not been obedient, if God is awesome. He, like Mordecai said, if she hadn't been obedient, deliverance would have come from somewhere else. But the book wouldn't be called Esther then, So Mordecai says this to her, these famous words of really encouragement, I think. I don't think they were words of correction. I think it was encouragement. Like, you are here for such a time as this. You've been preparing for this whole time, and you didn't even know it. That's how good God is, and that's how intricate his plan for us is. Whatever your season is right now, what is God preparing you for? Why are you there? Maybe you're there for such a time as this. I don't know. But so Esther, she receives this word from I was about to say Haman, not Haman, Mordecai. Amen. And she goes before the king and she tells him, look, if you don't do something about this decree, my people are going to perish, and I'm going to perish along with them. She said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor with him, and if he thinks it is right, and if I am pleasing to him, let there be a decree that reverses the orders of Haman, son of that person, who ordered that Jews throughout all of the king's provinces should be destroyed. And what I think is just so interesting about his response to her is he tells her, I can't reverse what I've already legislated, because once the king made a statement, once the king gave his word, it couldn't be undone, okay? It couldn't be erased or reversed. But he told her, look, I can legislate that Jewish people in my territory are able to protect themselves. It says, the king's decree gave the Jews in every city authority to unite to defend their lives. They were allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone of any nationality or province who might attack them or their children and wives, and to take the property of their enemies. So the fact that the king had to legislate that Jewish people were now allowed to protect themselves tells us that before they weren't. Isn't that interesting that, it says, okay, they had the authority to unite to defend their lives, and they're allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone of any nationality. So before, were they not allowed to defend themselves against some people or some nationalities? I can't imagine having to live like that, live like, okay, if I defend myself, am I going to be, subject to it being illegal that I, can't defend myself? Think about that. So the result of this was really more than just them not being annihilated on that day. They were able to defend themselves after that. It's just wild to think about. And, what I think is also really interesting about this is that today this is still something that is a little bit controversial. You think, okay, well, what could be so controversial about, Jewish self-determination, Jewish autonomy, having the right over what happens to you. But unfortunately, I've heard people say, I'm not for Jewish people banding together and defending themselves. It's crazy. I've heard people, in the flesh sitting across from me say, I'm anti-Zionism, which Zionism is the Jewish empowerment movement, okay, for self-determination of these people, okay? So it's not that different from like the civil rights movement in the 60s and the 70s of, African Americans advocating for, the right to be full people, okay? It's not that different. And so when Zionism really became a thing in the late 1800s, it was very similar. It was like, let us empower ourselves to determine our own fate and be autonomous. But for some reason, I have heard people say, oh, I'm anti-Zionism, and I've even heard people bragging about it, but you wouldn't brag about being anti-civil rights. It just doesn't really sit right, You don't brag about that. That isn't your catchphrase, but yet we hear people bragging. I've heard people bragging about this, especially on college campuses. So there's really, nothing new under the sun in this. And just like, God was faithful to Abraham when he made this promise to Abraham, he said, I'm going to give you descendants. I'm going to turn them into a nation. That was so impossible at the time. Because like I said, he wasn't, I really have to I really feel like I need to help you understand this. He and his wife were super old. Super, super old. He was 75 when this first promise came to him. And, God turned things around so dramatically that the Bible says that other men were coveting Abraham's wife, who was also really old. So God had to really turn some things around, right? Because for them to have a son, it wasn't just a miracle because they were old. It was a miracle because there was some other infertility, happening there. So he really, really turned a lot of things around. His situation was impossible. Just like I felt how can I tell people that they need to support Israel? How can I verbalize, why? It seemed so impossible at the time, but, God doesn't just leave us hanging. And even times when I got really discouraged and, I never, got quite as discouraged as Abraham with, all the things that, he did, but sometimes I would try to do things in my own strength. But you know what? It was never really about me. It was never really about Abraham in that case. It was only about how good God was and how faithful God was. And just like with Moses, it wasn't about, how perfect he spoke in front of people, because we know he didn't. But it wasn't even about that. And it wasn't about how eloquent Aaron was when Aaron came to his side and helped him. It was only about how good God was. And just like, Esther, it wasn't about, how much she wanted to be queen. It wasn't about, any preparation or training that she had to, meddle in the state affairs of Persia. It wasn't even about that, but other people were waiting for her obedience. So what I really want to leave you guys with tonight, more than anything, whatever the dream that God has put in your heart, really, whatever promises that he's made to you, God will be so faithful to it, even if even if you've forgotten the dream, or even if it seems impossible, even if you've, missed the mark a little bit, God will be faithful to you, even when you're faithless, because that's just who he is. That's just who he is, guys. So if while I was talking tonight, you felt like, man, maybe you didn't know anything that I was talking about. Maybe you didn't understand. I just sound like what, Israel? Maybe you're like me tonight when I was in high school and I just heard like, oh yeah, go Israel. Maybe that's you, but maybe there's something stirring in you tonight. Maybe you think, if I don't know more about this, I might be missing what God has for me. If that's you, I really want to invite you to connect with me afterwards. Come say hi, please. I would love to meet you. And I really want to get some resources into your hands to help you, just learn more about all of this. I really want to help you. I want to help you understand, okay? You can look up our website. We have a lot of resources listed on our website, cufioncampus.org, please. And also, Pastor Thomas is going to talk about, it's funny to call you Pastor Thomas, because my pastor's name is Tom, so I call him Pastor Tom. So I keep wanting to call you Pastor Tom. It's a little weird. But he's going to talk about this in detail later, but we every year bring about 400 to 500 college students and young people to our Washington, D.C. summit, where we hear from leaders of the Christian faith about why standing with Israel is so important, and we also hear from leaders of our country about why standing with Israel is so important. So if you're interested in that, we would love to have you. There's a bus of people coming from Living Word, actually. So we'd love to have you on that, and I would love to get to know you more there. So thank you so much, everybody.